In the 1930s, a blitzkrieg struck the world of Grand Prix. Two German teams, Auto Union and Mercedes, overwhelmed their rivals as comprehensively as Hitler's armies would crush Europe a few years later. Their impact when they arrived in Britain was equally shattering. British motor racing in those days was an amateur affair. Unlike the rest of Europe, there was no tradition of competing on public roads. Here at Castle Donnington in Derbyshire, the first road circuit was established only in 1931. Thanks to the competitions held at Donnington, the European style of racing soon became popular in Britain, even though the races lacked the spectacle of the Grand Prix events. They were organised by local car clubs for smaller and less powerful cars, such as sports cars and voiturettes, the class of racing below Grand Prix. In European terms, Donnington was a backwater, but here at last was a place for British racing drivers to learn their craft.
Although it was in a private park, it was like a very second-rate English public road. It was rather cambered, and the surface was not particularly good in the sense of being a non-skid. It was just the normal circuit of the time, the normal surface of the time. It was very much a driver's circuit, and so it was very much a favourite track of mine.
The course itself was so narrow that it was difficult for two cars to pass. The runoff areas were very small where they existed. In fact, at one place they went under a bridge, a little narrow bridge, which took one car, one width of car. The spectators, the bends, if they were lucky, there were straw bales put down, that was all. On the straights, there was no protection at all except a rope. And if you were sitting on the roof of a car, you were protected by your own car as much as anything else. And it was not uncommon at all to find people taking to the grass to pass people. You'd never believe it nowadays, all of the day's work.
British motorsport was galvanised by the competitions at Donnington. Before long, Britain even had its first single-seater racing car, the ERA, which stood for English Racing Automobiles.
When ERAs first suddenly appeared, they were based on Remus's White Riley, it was called, which he supercharged, and it was a six-cylinder Riley engine, and this car went extremely well. So then they decided that they would design and build a car on the lines of this Riley.
Patriotism was the motivation behind the ERA. British drivers who wanted to compete effectively in international events had to buy foreign cars, Alfa Romeos, Maseratis or Bugattis. To provide them with a British car to race, a prominent driver, Mayman, created a homegrown rival to the continental companies.
ERAs, of course, were really the only British racing car, serious British racing car. There were Rileys and things like that, but ERA was a purpose-built single-seater. They were as good as the equivalent Maseratis and certainly better than Bugattis of that era. And they captured the imagination of the British enthusiast.
Raymond May's pre-war project to build a competitive British racing car bore fruit. ERAs were very successful in Voiturette racing in the 1930s. They dominated British events and did well on the continent. They continued to show their paces after the war. Of the 17 cars built, 16 are still raced at historic meetings today, over 50 years later. The individual history of each one has been carefully documented.
And this particular car, it was numbered R4C then, was for Raymond Mays. This has got a 2-litre engine, and the supercharger is in the cockpit. It was one of only a few that had the supercharger in the cockpit. It means that you can run a much bigger supercharger, which gives it its extra power. This is a D-type chassis, the only one built, recognised by the fact that it's a drilled frame. Majority of ERAs have got a solid front axle, whereas this has got independent front suspension, which pre-war was felt to be an advantage. In this day and age, on our really smooth race circuits, it's a disadvantage because you've got a very, very soft front end countered with a very stiff back end, so it's not the easiest of handling cars.
Remus, otherwise known as R5B, was originally supplied to Prince Bira of Siam by his cousin Chula Chakraborn, who ran it for the 1936 season in Voiturette Grand Prix racing. And he was fairly successful in it.
Prince Bira was one of the most talented and fearless drivers in Voiturette racing. He was a master of the ERA, and his team bought 3 of the cars. They were given names: Romulus, Remus and Hannula. The 2 royal princes ran their racing team to bring prestige to their country, Siam.
Bira was fascinated by all things mechanical. Prince Chula was fascinated by the organisation.
He would set the whole plan up and would say to me, now England, we want to do this race, that. With this car, that car, can you have it ready? And if you said yes, it meant yes, and if you said no, you had to say no. But having done all this, I tested all the cars myself. And he would say, is the car right, England? Yes. All right, Bira, you drive it. And if Bira practice didn't go for you, stop him and say, Bira, you're slow, go faster. Is the car right, England? Yes, sir. Go faster, Bira.
Bira was the perfectionist driver, if you like. He was immaculate and consistent, and the fact remains he was the chap to beat in that class at that date.
Drivers like Bira and Raymond Mays made Voiturette racing popular in Britain. But it was a world away from the revolution in power and performance which was taking place in Grand Prix racing on the continent. With a thunderous roar, out of Germany came not 1, but 2 sensational racing cars from Auto Union and Mercedes.
It was as though, if you put it in present-day terms, somebody suddenly appeared with 2 teams, both of which were 50 miles an hour faster than the McLarens and the Ferraris and the Williams. Now you can imagine the impact. They introduced a new age in motor racing, and the drivers of these extraordinary vehicles, which could speeds up to 200 miles an hour, were extraordinary people. They're men apart. People like Brauchitsch and Nuvolari and Rosemeyer and Müller and Seaman and those people. They were a race apart.
In 1933, the Nazis came to power in Germany. They were quick to see the propaganda value in motor racing. Hitler decided to exploit its popularity to promote Germany's technical achievements.
I think it's about 1934 when we heard of the coming out of new cars such as the Mercedes and particularly the Auto Union. We overheard that the money that they were getting to make those cars was coming from Hitler, that he wanted his cars to win everywhere. They could get all the money they wanted as long as they were going to win. We could see a lot of things that we had never seen before. For example, they were coming in mass. They were not coming like we were with a team of a few mechanics, 1 or 2 trucks, and they were coming with not only mechanics and technicians from the factory, but also propaganda people.
Propaganda dictated where the cars would compete for the first time outside Germany. The choice was the French Grand Prix at Montlhéry on the 1st of July 1934. The two countries had long been motor racing rivals. France's premier race was always a fiercely nationalistic event. The new German cars made a good start, challenging France's best driver Louis Chiron for the lead. He was driving an Italian car, an Alfa Romeo, but all the French crowd wanted to see was the Germans beaten by a Frenchman. Under pressure from Chiron, the German cars all dropped out with mechanical problems, and he won the race. France celebrated, but the German breakdowns were only teething problems. After sorting them out, the two German teams embarked on a winning streak which was to last almost unchecked until the outbreak of war 5 years later. The man who more than any other gave Hitler the victories he wanted was Rudolf Caracciola. Already a leading Grand Prix driver, he joined the new Mercedes team after surviving a terrible accident at Monaco.
Caracciola already had his bad leg injury. He had continuous pain and he couldn't apply the brakes very hard. He just hadn't the power to do it. But he was a very delicate driver and he was in his best form on wet roads. Nobody could beat him. Surprisingly, he could see through strong rain without goggles. We don't know how he did it.
Caracciola's ability in wet conditions earned him the title of Regenmeister, Master of the Rain. But he went on to win a more prestigious title, European Champion, in 1935, 37 and 38. Where Mercedes was successful with a powerful but essentially conventional car, Auto Union was more radical in its approach. The most obvious difference was the position of the engine. It was behind the driver, predating modern racing car design by over 20 years. The idea came from the man who created the Volkswagen, the Austrian designer Dr. Ferdinand Porsche. Putting the engine in the middle of the car meant that the drive shaft no longer ran through the cockpit to the back wheels. The engine, gearbox and final drive could be designed as a single unit, making the car mechanically more efficient. Few of these great cars are in running order today, but in a demonstration at Silverstone, a Mercedes was driven by Neil Corner and an Auto Union by the former world champion John Surtees.
You've got to remember that it probably has something like close on 500 horsepower with tyres, you know, this sort of wide and about 40 years old at least. So it could be rather exciting if you let it get out of hand. First thing that impresses you is you're sitting in this car with this big 18-inch steering wheel about 2 inches from your chest, which is rather different to the sort of relaxed, arm-stretched way that we drove our Grand Prix cars and the people do today. These cars didn't get their power on the road, whereas a modern one, you know, you put your foot on the throttle and it sort of leaps forward with a lot of traction. These, if you just did that, would probably just spin their wheels. But it's a different era. Some of these older cars and even some of the modern ones, you know, you had to be very positive and force it into gear. But with this, it just went slick from gear to gear. And it was really beautiful to use. And this, coupled with that very willing and smooth V12 engine, was fantastic. The Auto Union is very much a Dr. Porsche car. It has some superb little details. And then you find that other things are very agricultural.
You know, it's this a massive contradictions in many ways. But of course, he obviously had a lot of foresight. He put the engine where it should be, he put the transmission where it should be, and basically it's a forerunner of what we have today. The Auto Union was certainly a much more nervous car. The Mercedes was an easier car to drive. Not necessarily a faster one, but it would certainly be easier to do a more consistent drive in the Mercedes.
For most of the late 1930s, the only rivals Mercedes and Auto Union had to face were each other. Auto Union was on top in 1936, but after that, Mercedes took the greatest share of the honours. Much of Mercedes' success sprang from the professionalism of its racing department. Everyone in it, from the ordinary draftsmen and mechanics to designers and drivers, were members of a well-drilled and highly motivated team. The car itself was a superb piece of engineering, immensely powerful and invariably reliable. It was the responsibility of the technical director of the racing department, Rudolf Uhlenhaut, a man who left nothing to chance.
When we arrived at a race course for a race, we were usually quite sure that our cars would last because we had tested them on a rolling test bench for several races.
Uhlenhaut believed that the best way to improve the cars was to drive them himself at racing speeds. He became an expert driver as well as a designer.
My father did it all alone. You know, he was the only engineer in the racing department there, and he had to do everything from chassis, brakes, tires, engine, carburation, everything. I think the most successful races for my father was always they were in Tripoli, because they had 3 races. In all 3 races, they had 1-2 victory. It was not with the European Championship, but it was a very important race because it was in Mussolini's department in Northern Africa, big show.
Mercedes' string of victories in the Tripoli Grand Prix convincingly demonstrated the superiority of German engineering over its Italian rivals. For the Mercedes team, there was an added bonus. The winning driver in all 3 races was a man who started as a fitter in the racing department and worked his way to the top to become a driver, Hermann Lang. Lang had been given his chance to drive by Mercedes team manager Alfred Neubauer. Neubauer was an impressive figure with a loud voice and an autocratic manner. He got results, but he was not at all popular.
If you go by noise, Neubauer was most prominent in the pits, but his actual influence was not too big. He had 2 stopwatches which never went right. Time taking was done by Mrs. Karlsruhe, who managed to take times of all drivers with 2 watches.
Neubauer started his career with Mercedes in the 1920s as a driver, but he never made the grade at Grand Prix level. What he did have was a flair for organization and tactics. He virtually invented the job of team manager to stay in racing. He was an innovator. He introduced the system of signal boards to communicate his instructions to drivers during the race, telling them what their position was or when to come into the pits. As manager, he selected the drivers, and though he preferred them to be German, he went for the best. So he signed up the finest British driver of the period, Dick Seaman. Seaman had learnt his skills racing Voiturettes in England. He had misgivings about joining a team backed by Hitler, but he couldn't resist driving for the all-conquering Mercedes. Alfred Neubauer planned every aspect of the race. At the German Grand Prix in 1938, his plan was for the German driver Manfred von Brauchitsch to win. Seaman was under strict instructions to stay behind him. Both cars came into the pits for fuel at the same time. an error by one of the mechanics spilt fuel over the rear of the leading car and it caught fire. Neubauer dragged Brauchitsch out of the cockpit, allowing Seaman to take the lead. For once, Neubauer's plan had gone slightly wrong. An Englishman had won the German Grand Prix. Still, it was another triumph for German technology and organization. The cash support from the Nazi government spurred Mercedes and Auto Union to further success. Over the Grand Prix circuits, the swastika fluttered exultantly and the German national anthem rubbed home the message. Hitler's investment in motor racing had paid off. Just occasionally, a man with exceptional skill did beat the all-powerful German machines. It happened most sensationally on Germany's home ground at the Nürburgring. In an obsolete Alfa Romeo, an Italian at the peak of his form drove brilliantly to snatch victory from the silver cars of Germany. His name was Tasio Nuvolari. Nuvolari is regarded as the greatest driver of his time. His huge collection of trophies is housed in his hometown of Mantua in northern Italy. Personal rivalry with other drivers kept him out of the German teams until 1938. He finally joined when Auto Union needed his winning touch.
Nuvolari was a legend. Give him a challenge and he rose to it. And he was a little man, 5'2", and he drove this enormous Auto Union 650 brake horsepower car at incredible speeds and against all odds.
Nuvolari is the finest driver there's ever been. I mean, he's won races on cars which were unsuitable for the race, as it were. And obviously, he was a magnificent driver, and well, he was just such a wonderful character, too.
He had, I think, fastest reflex than we had, all of us, because he could do things with his car that we couldn't do. He will almost lift his car in a corner, over a curb, for example. He will do things that I don't know how he was doing. Nobody knew. We were going to corners, all the drivers of my time, to see him drive. We were almost sure that he wouldn't be able to take that corner, and he was taking it beautifully.
Although he joined the Germans, Nuvolari will always be remembered for beating them. Only a very select group of drivers could make that claim.
One day, I had the great joy myself to beat the Mercedes. It was with a 12-cylinder De La Haye in 1938 when I won the Grand Prix of Pau ahead of Caracciola. The circuit in Pau was very difficult, and if you had too much power, it was on one way a handicap because the wheels were spinning. And this is what happened in that particular race. When they all thought that the Mercedes was going to win, I knew in myself that I was the one that was going to win that race. And it was a great joy in 1938 to be able to beat the Mercedes at Pau, to beat the Nazi automobile, and to hear for once in a long time the Marseillaise being played for me.
the British finally felt the impact of the mighty German racing teams when the Grand Prix came to Donnington in 1938. In one memorable afternoon, the power of Germany's revolutionary cars shattered this amateur world of voiturettes. It was an unforgettable experience.
The scene when these fantastic cars suddenly appeared over the brow of the hill, diving down along the long straight towards the hairpin, was such that people were simply astounded. And I have visions now of them, strangers, beating each other on the back and shouting in hysteria almost, to hear these and see these incredible vehicles on a narrow road, hurtling along at up to 200 miles an hour, going down the hairpin, up the other side, and leaping in the air over the crest of the hill, over the top.
When the Mercedes was coming down towards the pits, all you heard was this terrific scream. As it went past, the scream stopped and it blew your ears out with the exhaust noise, and it was this great change.
Being a race like that is very exciting, really. You can't be in their way at all, and whistle past you and be pushed off the circuit. When the straight were absolutely whizzed past you, but they weren't much quicker, funny enough, on the corners. I think they had so much power they couldn't put it to the wheels, you see. During the race, one car, an English car, blew up and all the oil went over the race. And these drivers are really fantastic. One of them went straight off the race and I don't know whether he jumped out of the car or was thrown out, went over the hedge. You know, the circuit at Donnington was so small and twisty, you know, narrow. And people were having their legs out on the circuit as the cars come along, moving their legs. No crowd protection at all. It was amazing.
They were all concrete. They swept everything before them. It was a sort of quite a fascinating era, really. The British learning about motor racing.